All right. All right, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, good. Shall I just start up?
Did we do any kind of an introduction from the gig before we get started?
Yeah. I can go ahead and do introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. Novakovsky. Thank you everyone for joining us. First of all, I want to thank again Dr. Novakovsky, Dr. Katz, Dr. Mazumdar, Dr. Suchak. I want to thank the Department of Geriatrics. I want to thank my classmates, Priscilla from the Disability Advocacy Series, and my wonderful gig officers, Rachel, Morgan, Joe, and Taylor. We are very excited to have Dr. Chris Gabbard joining us today. So as you can see, some people are in attendance through Zoom and some people are in attendance in person. If there are ever any questions, well, I'll start off with Dr. Chris Gabbard will be speaking for around 20 minutes. And then afterwards, if there's any room for any questions, either you can message me privately or you can write it into Zoom. And Rachel will be monitoring those folks who are attending in person, so we can have a microphone going around.
You're looking at your phone, who's going to be not paying attention.
And there we go. It's good to have multiple co-hosts so we can go around muting people who forgot to mute themselves. But other than that, like I said, Rachel will be meeting the people in person. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the chat or unmute yourselves after. So Dr. Chris Gabbard will be joining us today. He's, well, there's a lot I can say about him. Author of a book, great father, but I will go ahead and let him introduce himself. So Dr. Gabbard, as I said, he will be speaking for 20-25 minutes, and afterwards we'll have an open discussion if there's any room for questions. So that being said, Dr. Gabbard, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Roy, for that nice introduction. And I want to welcome everybody who's invited. I want to thank the people from the Geriatrics Interest Group and also the Department of Geriatrics and Disability Advocacy Series for inviting me to speak. It's a great honor to be able to have this opportunity to do that. I'm Professor Chris Gabbard. I teach at the University of North Florida. I'm a full professor there. I teach in the English department. And I teach a range of courses. Mostly I was trained in 18th century studies, but I've migrated into disability studies in the humanities and also into care studies. And also actually teaching creative nonfiction. So I wear a number of hats. So I've learned to try to be versatile and nimble. And anyway, so I'm going to read you basically about a 20-minute presentation. And then I welcome all your questions. Please take notes and pass them along to your moderators. So I'm happy to speak about whatever issues come up. So basically, I'm going to open these remarks by first making a long story short, and then I'll elaborate on the longer version of the story. The events I'm going to talk about concern the birth of our son, August 1999. I want to inject here that a compelling account can also be given of the events associated with his death in 2013. In fact, that account has more to do with the title of this talk than the story I'm actually going to tell you now. That account concerns everything with the implantation of an intrathecal Medtronic baclofen pump in 2010 that went wrong. And I'll be happy to speak about that during the question and answer period afterward. My story this evening, though, is going to be about a never event that took place in the delivery room the morning of August was born. This never event happened because a perfect storm occurred on the maternity floor in the early morning hours of Friday, March 5th, 1999. Too many mothers were giving birth simultaneously at a very moment when there was too few personnel available to deal with the surge. So first, here's the short version of the story. In preparation for the birth, my wife, Eileen, had carried out all the measures expected of an enlightened mother-to-be living in a technocratic society. She and I undertook genetic testing before conceiving, looking for signs of Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, and other conditions. Eileen underwent an amniocentesis in the early gestation period. She also followed all the recommendations for a healthy pregnancy found in What to Expect When You're Expecting and other sources. And in the late winter and early spring of 1999, all test results pointed to healthy development. Eileen's pregnancy was deemed to be low risk, and her first doctor at the University of California, San Francisco, henceforth simply UCSF, allowed the baby to go 11 days past the due date before inducing labor. 2 UCSF doctors managed the 43-hour labor. The first delivery doctor was Sarah Kay. Kay is an initial, not a name. She was the attending physician whose specialty was perinatology, and she now chairs a department of obstetrics and gynecology at a major Los Angeles teaching hospital. As you know, a perinatologist is a doctor trained in the subspecialty of obstetrics concerned with complicated and high-risk pregnancies. The second delivery doctor was a resident physician, Lisa L. Again, an initial, not a name. She's now practicing at Scripps Health in San Diego. Dr. Sarah K. and Dr. Lisa L. delivered the baby vaginally despite serious signs of distress coming from the fetal heart monitor at 2:55 a.m., 49 minutes prior to the birth at 3:44 a.m. And I'll elaborate on this in a moment. The resident physician, Dr. Lisa L., did about 98% of managing Eileen's labor. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah K., was rarely present. And when she was in the room, she was only in there for a minute or two. She would dash into the room only to immediately dash out again. Due to her habit of dashing, seemingly leaving a trail of smoke in her wake, Eileen, Patty, our friend helping with the birth, and I humorously dubbed her Dr. Dash Smoke. Henceforth, I will identify her by her humorous moniker, Dr. Dash Smoke. At 2:55 that morning, the main labor and delivery nurse, henceforth the L&D nurse, said while looking at the fetal heart monitor readout, quote, "These vitals are not reassuring. I don't believe the baby's heart rate should be this low," end quote. What the L&D nurse was trying to tell the resident physician was that she was detecting signs of bradycardia. Bradycardia signals that the baby is in distress and that the delivery team has about 30 minutes to get the baby out, and it's usually by C-section. Dr. Lisa L. dismissed the L&D nurse's concern in the monitor readout on the assumption that the monitor was unreliable or malfunctioning or telling her an inconvenient truth, or gosh knows what the heck she was thinking. More about that in a minute. Later in the 6-week postpartum check, Dr. Dashsmoke told Eileen that our son's catastrophic birth was attributable to, quote, bad luck, end quote. And this was the only explanation that she or anyone at UCSF, for that matter, ever gave us. Bad luck was the cause of our baby's severe brain damage. All the data evidently pointed to this etiology. We named our son August, and as I read the list of his official diagnoses, I'm going to sound like a hyper-ambitious district attorney overcharging a murder suspect, but here goes. Hypoxic, ischemic encephalopathy, cerebral palsy, spastic quadriplegia, profound mental retardation, cortical visual impairment, microcephaly, seizure disorder, osteopenia, and there's more. August Jason Gabbard died 14 years later as a delayed outcome of the way he was delivered. And that essentially is the short version of August's birth story. And now here's the long version of the story. My wife, Eileen, was employed as a clinical professor of physical therapy at UCSF. She had been working at UCSF for about 7 years. And because it was her place of work and because she trusted the institution, she chose to have her birth there. She had successfully treated the dean of the medical school who'd had a problem with his knee, and she'd helped him return to running. So as a little thank you, he assigned her one of the medical center's VIP delivery suites. Located at the Parnassus campus, it was the kind of birth suite reserved for the wives of rich oil sheikhs flown in from Saudi Arabia. It offered a panoramic view of downtown San Francisco. As for me, back in 1999, I was 4 months away from becoming a doctor, but I wasn't going to become that kind of doctor. I was just finishing my doctoral work at nearby Stanford University in British 18th century literature. And of all the advice one of my dissertation advisors gave me, this was the best. Never reserve a table at a restaurant in the name of Dr. Gabbard. You may find yourself in an embarrassing situation. What he meant was if someone at the next table were to go into cardiac arrest, it wouldn't help much to be a doctor of the epistolary novel. At the time, my faith in American medicine couldn't have been more complete. I viewed medicine as the pinnacle of progress. It had evolved exponentially over the preceding 2 centuries. Birth had been made easier. In 1821, the Vicomte de Kergaradec was the first practitioner to recommend assessing fetal heart sounds for diagnostic purposes. And in 1853, William John Riddle was the first to argue that cerebral palsy stemmed from a lack of oxygen at birth. Given this advancement, no problem should arise with the simple matter of delivering a baby. The trouble was a problem had come up during the labor, but no one was available to deal with it. As I said earlier, the main L&D nurse warned Dr. Lisa L. at 2:55 about the signs of bradycardia. Eileen was in her 42nd hour of labor. Dr. Dashsmoke, as usual, was not in the delivery suite. Dr. Lisa L. seemed to think that the monitor was picking up the mother's heartbeat and not the baby's. To the best of my recollection, the resident did not subsequently check Eileen's pulse rate by taking a pulse or use a pulse oximeter to compare what it was reporting to what the fetal monitor was indicating. But even if the resident took one of these actions and I missed it, I never heard her or the L&D nurse talk about following up by repositioning the scalp electrode, the fetal monitor's sensor on the fetus, so that the monitor was ascertaining the baby's heart rate. And even if I missed that too, I never heard anyone say words to the effect of, oh, there's the baby's heartbeat. So in retrospect, the question to consider is, if the fetal heart rate monitor reading had been of the mother's heart and not the baby's, wouldn't that have then meant that the baby was going unmonitored? To be plain, the premise of the fetal monitor was to communicate to the medical personnel outside the womb whether it was the health status of the fetus inside the womb. If there was a technical problem, it needed to be corrected. Otherwise, why bother to use the technology? 7 minutes later, at 3:03 a.m., Dr. Dashmoke did step into the birth suite for less than a minute. The resident told her that there was a problem occurring with the fetal monitor. Dr. Dashmoke did not respond, and the resident did not repeat herself. Dr. Dashmoke was obviously in a hurry. But before dashing out, though, she unexpectedly shouted, "We're going to have a baby." This exclamation was so out of character for her that I did a double take, and then she was gone. Shortly after her departure, Eileen was found to be maximally dilated. Preparations were made, among which included at 3:10 removing the fetal heart monitor attachment. And then a long pause ensued. Suddenly, without explanation, Dr. Lisa L. disappeared out the door. That was at a little after 3:10 a.m. By 3:15 a.m., the room had grown eerily quiet. Then the L&D nurse said, "I'm going to check on something," and she scurried out too. This was the same L&D nurse who 20 minutes earlier had been announced that the baby's heart rate was too low. And I could still see that she was still worried about it. What we didn't know at the time, but suspect now, is that a surge of births was taking place on the maternity floor right at the moment our son was about to be born. I surmised that the L&D nurse, Dr. L, went out to try to round up a delivery team. So from 3:15 to 3:27 a.m., for 12 minutes, my wife, our friend Patty, and I were left alone in the delivery suite. At 3:27 a.m., Dr. L returned and Dr. Lisa L followed her a minute later. Dr. Dashmoke didn't appear for another 5 minutes, not until 3:33. She obviously had heard what Dr. L had said to her 30 minutes earlier at 3:03, because the first thing she asked when she came through the door was, there was a problem with the monitor? A short and seemingly casual conversation followed about whose heart rate the now detached fetal heart monitor had been reading at 38 minutes earlier, 2:55. Given the low numbers, Dr. Dashmoke quickly affirmed, yes, it must have been the mother's, meaning the device must have been picking up the mother's heartbeat, not that of the baby. The two doctors were completely at ease, exhibiting no sense of urgency. Dr. Dashmoke took her time as she gowned and gloved up. It wasn't until 9 minutes later, at 3:42 a.m., that Dr. Dashmoke finally recognized that there was a problem. The baby's head was crowning, and Dr. Dashmoke was crouching between Eileen's knees. Suddenly, she shouted, "There's an abrasion on the baby's head." And then almost immediately, she yelled, "We're going to use the vacuum." This would be a vacuum-assisted vaginal delivery. The baby was extracted at 3:44 a.m., and he popped out gray, limp, and lifeless. His color was like that of a stillborn baby. He looked dead. A specially dispatched team went to work attempting to resuscitate the newborn, but who knows how long the baby went before taking his first breath. Was it 2, 3, 4 minutes, more? Finally, he did gasp for air. The newborn is whisked away to the intensive care nursery, henceforth the ICN, in the Benioff Children's Hospital on another floor. We were told an hour or so later that his chances of survival were 50-50. And eventually, over succeeding days, his condition stabilized, and the question changed from whether he would live to what his quality of life would be. The hospital scheduled August for discharge on Monday, March 15th, 10 days after the birth. But before I could release him, its representatives had to sit down with us. On the preceding Friday, March 12th, 11 o'clock a.m., We assembled in the windowless conference room somewhere in the bowels of UCSF. This was the family consultation, one of the undertakings that the National Hospital Accrediting Agency, then known as the JCAHO, required of UCSF for such cases as ours. Green is an Oregon forest. I had high expectations going into the family consultation. Dr. Dashmoke and Dr. Sarah Kay would solve the mystery, the riddle of what had happened to our son. My idealistic expectations were speedily demolished. Dr. Dashmoke and Dr. Lisa L. did not attend, and no one from the OBGYN practice with which Eileen had undertaken her prenatal care was there either. Instead, we met with 5 hospital representatives, 4 male doctors and 1 woman, a social worker. 2 doctors we've seen briefly in the ICN, the other 2 we'd never seen before. We were told that August suffered from hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy and various conditions already enumerated. The physicians described August's medical situation in the present, but avoided discussing what brought about the brain damage. They did not want to talk about causation. Prior to this meeting, Eileen had heard through the hospital grapevine that on the day of August's birth, his case had been discussed in the morbidity and mortality rounds. But whatever was spoken of in the M&M rounds wasn't being shared with us at this family consultation. That was very frustrating. For 45 minutes, Eileen and I repeatedly asked, what happened to our son? But the answers the doctor repeatedly gave us were, we can't say, and we don't know. They, of course, were not going to say anything that would lead to us filing a malpractice suit. On some invisible cue, the meeting started winding down. One of the doctors leaned back in his chair and cradled his neck with his hands so that his elbows fanned up like wings. Looking like a bird in flight, he asked, what are your plans? Our plans, I replied. This was a strange question. For a moment, I thought about the future. It seemed like we didn't have a future. I felt like a condemned man on the scaffold with the noose already around his neck and the hangman asking, what are your plans? At last, I answered, we plan to learn how to give our baby phenobarbital. This meeting was the last official contact we had with UCSF regarding the birth, with 2 exceptions. The first exception arrived in the mail. It was the hospital's patient satisfaction survey. We didn't fill it out. The second exception was Eileen's postnatal visit with Dr. Dashmoke 6 weeks after the birth. As I said earlier, the most information the doctor offered Eileen at that postpartum check about August's catastrophic birth was that it was due to bad luck. As a woman of science, Eileen didn't find this explanation satisfying. Dr. Dashmoke might as well have used a perfectly serviceable medical term from the 18th century, telling us that our boy was a lusus naturae, a freak of nature. 7 months after the birth, in October 1999, Eileen resumed working at UCSF. After she went back, the doctors and the administrative staff avoided her. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew what had happened and no one felt comfortable, and things never improved. She was relieved, therefore, when in June of 2001, she resigned her position at UCSF. Pulled back from the brink of death, August became Lazarus in a wheelchair. During his 14 years, he was incontinent, spastically paralyzed, and cortically blind. He also was nonverbal. He never once uttered the word mommy, or any other word for that matter. He could not sit in a chair in the way a typically developing child would. He needed upper trunk support, so he was secured in his wheelchair with straps holding his shoulders and chest in place. His neck muscles never developed properly, so when he was propped upright, his head lolled, falling backward and forward. He also drooled, and this occurred because the spasticity affecting the muscles in his mouth prevented him from being able to swallow his saliva efficiently. When he was lying on the floor, he was unable to crawl, scoot around, hold himself up, roll over, or even touch his toes. If someone were to put him down on the floor in one spot and leave him there, he would be found in the same location an hour later, give or take a few inches. August passed away on October 15, 2013. After he died, I had time on my hands. I no longer had to take care of my extremely high maintenance child. So I started to sift through his birth records, the stack of documents 7 inches high. I was trying to answer the riddle, what happened to our son? I learned nothing definitive, but I did gain insights here and there. It wasn't until 2015 that something like an answer came. Eileen arrived home one evening from her physical therapy practice, the one she now owned and operated, and told me that she'd had an interesting conversation with one of her patients, whom, for confidentiality's sake, I will call Dr. Hermes after the ancient Greek messenger god. An anesthesiologist in his early 60s, he was a physician who had served on many obstetric cases at Baptist Hospital in Jacksonville. During the physical therapy section, the conversation turned to August's birth, and at Dr. Hermes' behest, she told him the story. When she finished, he remained silent for a moment, and then he said, quote, I can't say for certain what happened, but this sounds like a classic case of obstructed labor. This is also known as labor dystocia, and it occurs because the baby can't exit the pelvis during childbirth due to being blocked. This happens even if the uterus is contracting normally. Eileen responded that she had had a lot of pain in her pelvic area despite the epidural. Dr. Hermes said, quote, his head might have been hitting against the pelvic bone. It'd be like ramming your head into a door slowly but repeatedly, like this, he said, and demonstrating, he slammed his fist into his palm, then paused, then slammed it again, and again paused. Bam, pause, bam, pause, bam, pause, bam. Stories of medical error are easy to dismiss, but a close family member of Dr. Hermes had recently experienced a very serious one, so he was open to the idea. And then he said something that was unprecedented, for us at least. Quote, someone should have noticed that the labor wasn't progressing and ordered a C-section. I am truly sorry that August received such poor care. That shouldn't have happened. Eileen responded by saying that a medical error isn't a figment of our imaginations. Dr. Hermes chuckled quietly, shook his head and said, is that what they wanted you to believe? Listen, here's what probably happened. It's not complicated. August experienced fetal distress during the delivery, and maybe he was experiencing it in the days leading up to the delivery. But whenever it started, it wasn't detected. And as a result, he suffered severe brain injury and cerebral palsy. And that's why he had the life he did. For 16 years, Eileen and I have sought to solve the riddle of what had happened in the birth suite. What happened to our son? No physician had ever been willing to offer an explanation, but Dr. Hermes was willing to venture an educated guess. And now, 2 years after August's death, we had an answer to the riddle of his birth. The answer to a riddle always seems more obvious once it is revealed. Everything that Eileen and I know today in 2021 about August's delivery was not apparent to us in 1999, the year that our son came into our lives, or even for years afterward. It took 16 years to piece together the never event that occurred in the delivery suite. We solved the mystery of what happened at August's birth 2 years after his birth, 2 years after his death. And we only did it by serendipity. We only solved it because one doctor with some knowledge about the subject was willing to stop, listen to our story, and give us his opinion. Things shouldn't have to be like that. In matters as important as this, parents should not be left in the dark. But in all too many cases, that's the way it is. Those are my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gabbard. So I know several of us actually read the book, and there's way more details and a lot of frustrating events that happen, and a lot of feelings of hopelessness, but also you also did a great job about talking about your son and how much you loved him, and all the positivity that came with that. Mm-hmm. So I would want to open this to the floor if anyone else has any questions, but if not, then I have a few questions. And I think Dr. Katz, do you want to?
Well, I want to leave plenty of time for everyone, but you know, after I read the book, I was impressed by a number of issues that you've alluded to, and hopefully we'll have time to get into some of them. But I want the medical students to realize that your story exemplifies many of the issues that we try to teach the students. One of them, for example, is cognitive bias. And you gave an incredible story of how, I think it's Lisa L., the resident.
Yeah.
She figured out, she had a bias that this is what was happening, and then closed off to any other further information that would negate her working hypothesis. And of course, that didn't cause it, but it led to many of the issues that that resulted with your son. The other issue is the value of truth telling. Now, we may have not have, maybe all the students haven't yet had this in small groups, but we try to encourage truth telling when bad things happen. And you went through a decade and a half of not knowing the truth, which I assume would have allayed a lot of anxiety that you were dealing with. Because I think as parents, you always think it's maybe it's something we did. It was our fault. And so I'll stop there because there's so many other things to talk about. But I want to thank you for your book and reliving this incredibly challenging life story of your son, the bravery of you and your wife. So thank you again, Chris.
I would just like to piggyback off something you said, Dr. Scott, and that is that my wife blamed herself for years and years because she thought she must have done something wrong. And yet we were the couple that went and had testing to see if we had Tay-Sachs or any other genetic condition. Even before we conceived the baby, we'd left no stone unturned. But she thought because she worked in a hospital, she felt especially foolish for not having caught the signs. It was especially because she worked in a hospital. She thought she should have known better. She should have seen what was coming. And so she just carried the weight psychologically. She still carries that weight. She's been through a lot of therapy since then. I have to say that I don't carry that same kind of angst. My disappointment is different, but hers is very visceral. It's a lot about being a woman, giving birth and not having done it successfully, and also having been a medical professional and not having what she felt were caught the signs of what should have been obvious signs.
So I actually wanted to bounce off something else that Dr. Katz said. So as medical students, I think these next parts are important. So there is several parts in your book. If it's okay, I'm just going to read somewhere. There would just be a stigma towards not only August, your son, but also towards your family. And just because he was different, people would come up to you and just wouldn't know what to say. So there's one page in your book when people would come up to you and say, everything happens for a reason, or God chose well when he made you his parents. And I'm just reading quotes from your book when you said that. And and this is all part of God's plan, or God gives special kids to special parents. And reading that, it's just like, so you said that that they mean well when they say this, but it really doesn't do any well. So my question to you is, as medical students, can you describe to us more about your good interactions with the doctors as well as the bad interactions with the doctors that you had? And sorry, one addition I want to make is we actually had a faculty lecturer who's actually present with us today. About they adopted a child with fetal alcohol syndrome, and actually invited him, and he is here in attendance. And I saw a lot of similarity with the stigma that you described as well. Is even with doctors, they even though we know we're trained to be professional and be kind and all that, but the stigma is always there. And again, that goes back to what I was saying about how you not only August was ostracized, but your family was ostracized, and kind of, people didn't really want anything to do with you and stuff like that. So I'm sorry that was long, but can you tell us more about the good and bad interactions that you've had with physicians?
Let me just say one more thing about the ostracization. What happened with my daughter, that there were, my daughter, we have two children. We had two children. We still have one. And the daughter, when she was growing up, there were people she met at her school she wanted to be playmates with, but the parents wouldn't let the child come over and play with us at our house because there was a boy in a wheelchair in the house. Just the idea, and this also just happened in Jacksonville. It happened in San Francisco, where there were some kids at the daycare center who wanted to play with August, and one of the parents told staff to keep her daughter away from August because she didn't want her daughter interacting with a child that was so disabled. So it's almost like this, the stigma is real, and what hurt really was when I heard the one about my daughter and the playmate. That really kind of stuck me in the heart. It's like, wow, that is prejudice. Anyway, about the range of interactions we had with doctors was tremendous. We met great doctors, and we met doctors that were pretty disappointing. I think I'll go for the disappointing and then go to the great. The most disappointing was a neurologist that's here at the local children's hospital. And when we first moved from San Francisco in 2001 to Jacksonville, my wife set up appointments with all the medical people, Nemours and Wolfson. And so she went to see the neurologist, and the neurologist, she wanted to have a neurologist do an evaluation. And when the neurologist was finished, she kind of said cheerily, "Okay, what do you think?" And he turned to her, and he must have assumed that because she is so cheery and trying to be so upbeat in her tone, that she must have been living in la la land and not understand just how disabled. So he decided at that moment he was going to lay everything out as explicitly as possible, just how little prognosis, how poor the prognosis was for the boy, in the worst possible terms. We had just come from California, where we generally, our interactions with medical community, they seemed to understand that we were having a difficult time, and so they didn't necessarily want to add on any more negative information. They too tried to maintain a somewhat upbeat outlook, hoping that because the brain is plastic, there's possibility for some level of recovery. And we met this neurologist here in Jacksonville, and he was about as negative could be. And he just laid it out. He won't live long. He's not going to do anything. It's hopeless. Very much a why bother approach. And this had ramifications later, years later, because our son had this baclofen pump, and he was having some neurological problems, and physiologist wanted to go see the same neurologist, and my wife was not going to walk through that door again and see that man, because there was nothing but negativity associated with him. And that meant it took a lot longer for us to get a neurologist, because we had to go outside the system and find another one, because that was the only one available to us in network. So that kind of attitude doesn't help at all. Just to think you're going to tell the parent of a disabled child the worst possible scenarios, thinking you're laying it on the line in some truthful way. There was one other physician on the negative end. This was at Wolfson. Our son spent 2 long segments in 2010, one in 2010, one in 2012, each one about 60 days in the hospital. And in one of these stints, there was a young raven-haired physician, female, who came in to lecture me that I was apparent in denial, that I was not accepting that my son suffered from cerebral palsy. And she really laid it out. And I just thought, gosh, lady, you have no idea what you're talking about, as though I had not thought our son had cerebral palsy from the day pretty much he was born. And you're telling me now that I'm in denial. So I don't need you. And there was another young physician, male, who came in to view my son. We didn't know at the time, but he was suffering from dystonia. He was arching terribly. And he came into the room, and a lot of doctors at Wolfson came in to take a look, to try to figure out what's going on here, because they couldn't diagnose the kid. They didn't know yet. They hadn't arrived at the diagnosis of dystonia. And he just called in and kind of joked about how that can't be comfortable. He was all balled up into a knot. My boy's all balled up into a knot. And the physician comes in and says something as glib as, "Oh, that can't be comfortable," with kind of a smile on his face, like he's completely detached from the situation. So that's the low end. On the high end, again, during those 2 long stays, 2010, 2012 at Wolfson, there was a pediatric surgeon, and his own child has spent about 6 months in Wolfson, and he completely understood what we were going through, because his own child had been in the hospital and had a lot of very serious medical problems. And we were having a battle because we had a JG tube, and line kept getting dislodged in the jejunum and a JG. And we had lots of problems with that. And he trusted me with his personal cell number and said, "Call me whenever you have a problem." And I tried not to take advantage of that until there was an absolute crisis or emergency. And then I would call him, and he always picked up the phone, and he always answered. and he always got on the ball, and he tried to figure out what the problem was and responded. And no matter what he was doing, no matter what time of the day or the night, I only called him about 3 or 4 times, but sometimes I had to call him because we were just at our wits' end and there was no other course to do. And he picked up the cell phone and answered and gave us his full attention. Now, I'm thinking about him because his own child had been in the hospital. He understood exactly what we were going through and he could empathize fully. And just also like the way that Dr. Hermes, the anesthesiologist, his own family member had undergone a medical error. So he realized there was such a thing as medical error. It was a real thing. It had happened to us. And because of that happened, his personal experience of that opened him to be able to listen. Just listen to the story. You know, he didn't do anything to solve the problem, really, except that he did just give us like, this sounds like it must have been this, and it's very likely that's why he had the life he did. But that was what we needed. After 16 years, we had nothing like that. So the doctors who I found who had the strongest response often had some personal background, some connection, either with a disabled person or a person who had had a lot of illness, or someone who suffered a medical error, or someone who has some adverse event or something terrible that happened to them in their family. And I found they were way more open and often willing to go the extra mile. Now, there also was in 2010, August physiatrist was trying to help August with his spasticity. And August had been getting Botox injections and baclofen by mouth, oral baclofen. And that was pretty much managing the spasticity. But she began to try to edge us toward the Medtronic intrathecal Medtronic baclofen pump, which is like basically kind of the go big or home solution for dealing with spasticity. And August also had a pediatrician named Dr. Lazoff. He's now retired, living in North Carolina, off in the mountains. And Dr. Lazoff didn't so much as want to, Dr. Lazoff just basically said, proceed very carefully, because he was an older physician and he had seen a lot go wrong with the Medtronic pump. He actually had insights into all sorts of cases of kids who've gone through the neuropediatric program in Wolfson Hospital, where they had planted a lot of these pumps, and a lot of those pumps had not turned out well. The physiatrist wasn't telling me about those negative outcomes, how a lot of the pumps had to be taken back out again because of infection or some sort of event that had happened that made the pump not function properly or whatever. So it wasn't anywhere near 100% positive return rate. And Dr. Lazoff repeatedly warned us not to go down this route. And he told us this is probably what's going to happen. Let's continue with the Botox injections and the oral baclofen, and he's getting the relief he needs. But on the other side were the doctors who are very pro-technology. The physiatrist was a young woman who was very much taken, you know, we all get taken by new technology. Who doesn't want the new gadget? Who doesn't want to live in the brave, well, maybe you don't want to live in the brave new world, but you want to live in some world where technology seems to be solving our problems. And that seems to be what the Medtronic pump was doing. So on the one hand, we had a young woman who was August physiatrist telling us the pump is the way to go. It's going to solve a lot of his problems. And she was downplaying all the things that could go wrong. And then we had Dr. Lazoff, who was really trying to get us to see that this was a very dangerous course to go down, and it often didn't turn out well. And he had personal experience, but he couldn't talk about it with us because, of course, there's privacy regulations and HIPAA and all that. So Dr. Lazoff, you know, if we had listened to him, we would have been, August would still be alive. I'm pretty confident of that. But because things went so south with the pump, and if we had listened to him, all the things that Dr. Lazoff predicted would happen, happened. He already been down that road and he's seen that. And I wish we had listened to him. So there are doctors who basically kind of buck the trend. I mean, it's unpopular to be a doctor and to tell your patient that they really are on, the patient wants this thing, they want this drug or they want this device, and they really want it. And the doctor has to kind of have some integrity and principles and just be willing to say no, that the patient isn't always right. The patient doesn't maybe see the whole picture, even though there's a lot of pressure maybe that has brought the patient to want to have that, what seems like a solution to their problem. So there's a wide range of people we interacted with, many good interactions, definitely not anti-doctor. I think medicine is a noble profession. There's a reason why that back in the 18th, 17th century, the priests wore the black, and now today the new priests of the day, the modern era, wear white. In some ways, doctors have become the new priesthood, but there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that role. So I don't know, does that answer your question? It's the beginning of an answer.
Yes, yes, and especially the part about listening. I think that was really important as well.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, I think. Like Emily, Dr. Gabbard, I was in one of your classes, it seemed like many years ago.
You look familiar, yes, I know.
That's me. So and I remember you turned your English class into at least a little intro onto healthcare systems. And I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on how our healthcare system, in all of its glory and flaws, could change, or maybe the policies that we have could change in order to ensure that we have better transparency between our providers and their patients, especially when it comes to medical errors. Do you have any ideas? Sorry.
Well, can I get a bulldozer? I'd have to, there's so much that it would have to change. I mean, you saw what happened in 2011 or 2010 with ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and how you change one thing and it creates a ripple effect, and it changes this and it changes that and changes the other thing. And pretty soon you can't talk about the butterfly's wings flapping without having to change the whole system. If you had greater transparency, then you'd have to face the possibility of, well, if those doctors at the family consultation had leveled with us and told us what had happened, we don't have any choice but to sue, to be honest, because the cost of August care was going to run into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And there isn't a social safety net that's very adequate to deal with all the stuff that you have to go through raising a child as impaired as August was. So that's the first thing, and people are not going to, I just don't see, I understand why the doctors couldn't, they had to say, we don't know and we can't say. Because they leave the whole institution open to liability. The litigation, once they start being transparent, there's a lot of things that happen that are beyond any one individual's or doctor's control. For example, Dr. Sarah Kay, the attending, it wasn't really her mistake that the resident misjudged the fetal heart monitor, but she's the doctor of record. So she's the one who takes the brunt. So she's the focus point for a lawsuit that would come on. Is that fair? It is and it isn't. It was also unfair that she had way too many births happening at one time. So she lost control of the situation. I mean, how did an experienced practitioner make such a big mistake? So you have to deal with, okay, transparency, yes, but then transparency doesn't begin to deal with this, how complicated the chain of blame would be in a situation like that. In a fair world, there should have been compensation, because there's no way that we, a middle-class family, a teacher and a physical therapist, can afford to pay $1 million or more in medical care and devices and special vans and caregivers and all that stuff. That'd just be beyond our ability. So we would have no choice but to sue, and the state is not going to come forward, especially in Florida. Florida is one of the worst states for that kind of thing. So I'm not sure where to begin. I've thought a lot about this. I thought a lot about a lot of the problems in medical care, because this really did open my eyes and made me think and really ponder, because I'd always thought that medical care in America was like the pinnacle, the height, the most advanced in the world, and it is. But it's good at some things, really terrible at others. Transparency is one of them. It's really good at rescue care. It's really good if you're in a crisis, because we as Americans are good at rising to the occasion if there's a crisis. And then we rally all the troops to get everything together, and we go and do whatever it is we need to do to save that person. But the day-to-day mundane activity of providing care, we aren't interested in preventive care, for example. Very interested, because we're not remunerated. You're not going to be paid to counsel patients about eating better, exercise, how to make lifestyle choices. It's going to be systems that are just sort of forcing people to do things that they know aren't probably the best, but they have to basically give out pills because they don't have the time to do the labor intensive counseling that people really need in order to make intelligent choices to live more healthfully. So I don't have a solution. And in places in Florida, as you know, in this state, there was a law passed in the late 80s, I think. And the idea was to keep down litigation on issues like this about, bad cases in child delivery. But it didn't help the families ultimately. It kind of backfired. And so the families who needed the most help from that program never got it. So, sometimes even the best laid, best intentioned programs don't deliver what you hope they will. So I'm not here with a solution. And besides, I have no background in how medical institutions run, and I really can't tell the experts what they should do.
I appreciate you trying.
We have a question in person. And someone just raised their hand.
Is that my turn? Okay, thanks.
Let's do the in-person question, and then Stephen is going to ask a question afterwards.
All right, great. Thanks, Dr. Gabbard. My question picks up on the heels of where you left off, and that is, I wanted to find out, but you've already answered, and that is, was there anything that you and your family had done to kind of put the M&M group or the family counseling group on edge to essentially put them on the defensive? And I suspect the answer to that question is no. But more importantly, what I'm really interested in hearing about is you're obviously talking to a bunch of medical students, and you've laid out the competing commitments that they have, right? They need to simultaneously treat their treat their patients while also protecting their entity that's employing them. So as somebody who's gone through that experience, how would you counsel these one day doctors into being able to live with the decisions that they may be making as part of those competing commitments?
It's probably the same thing I would counsel myself when I'm teaching English at the University of North Florida. I try to make little changes wherever I can. I can't change the systems that I recognize are not fair or are not really productive, but I can help on the individual basis, one by one. I've had to reconcile myself to the idea that I work and live in a big institution, just like many of you as medical students and then eventually doctors will be too, where you don't get to run the show. You didn't make that world. You have expectations on you. You have little time. But if you can look for the little moments when you can make a difference in someone's individual life, like Dr. Hermes, just basically being as helpful as you can on the one-on-one basis. I'm not going to sit here and counsel that there should be major overhaul and reform or revolution, because that's not going to happen. But what you can do in your individual lives and your individual practice is just try to make the difference on the one-on-one level with the patients, and to listen to what they have to say. Try to empathize with them, understand their world, step into their shoes as best you can, given everybody's human limitations.
I'd like to ask a question if time permits. So I'd like to ask a personal question. Of course, you don't have to respond. My sister has an amazing 4-year-old son, my nephew, who had a very extensive labor at birth as well. And he had a stroke. He has cerebral palsy. He can't grasp onto anything, and he cannot walk, although he's showing signs that he might be able to. And she had 2 children that she adopted because she had very unsuccessful pregnancies, and this was her 3rd child. She felt so successful that she finally could have a full-term birth. And so I'd like to, what do you, when you were talking about your wife, how she feels this pain she's dealing with, how do you deal with that?
Well, time does heal. It isn't something she walks around thinking about a lot now. because it's 20 years, over 20 years has gone by. But I'd say for the first, it wasn't until she had another child, to tell you the truth, it was our second child, and that kind of lifted a lot of the weight, the burden, and the cloud. And then she became totally focused on the second child. I became the parent of the first child. We had division of labor after that. And then all her attention kind of got distracted onto that. But your sister probably isn't in a situation where she could do that. My wife also had a lot of therapy, which actually turned out to be very helpful. It's just something that has to be talked out over time. And then also time does heal.
Well, I want to say, I'm so sorry for your loss, but the excerpt you read was extremely powerful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. If I could just say something, I know it's sort of unscripted here, and I know there's more questions, so I'll make it short. But I got into disability studies on account of my son. And one thing I began to realize that, the whole rise of the disability rights movement in the 1980s, 1990s had a lot to do with there were a heck of a lot more disabled people. Modern technology has not produced fewer disabled people, it's produced more of them. And the reason why it has produced more of them is that the miracles of medical science are preserving people alive. But often when they save people, it doesn't necessarily mean they're saved in the same state that they were prior to whatever it is that they had the mishap or the illness or whatever. Often, because medical science has been so successful at saving people's lives, people emerge with compromised bodies and they wind up being disabled. And I just a little insight that I had from my son's experience is that he was rescued when he was dead, brought back to life like Lazarus, but then he had a terribly impaired life ever after. And American medicine is really good at rescuing people, but we don't often think about the aftermath of what was it like a year later? Did they really recover fully? Did they recover half, 50%, 25%? Did they come back to a regular life, or were they functionally impaired in some major way? And my insight about the disability rights movement is that there's more and more people out there who have that some version of that story of having been saved, but then being disabled afterward. So their lives were saved and everyone's happy. We all want, we want our lives to be preserved, but we often come back disabled. And that's why you have this political movement of people who are saying, well, we still have lives, we still have meaning, we still have purpose, we still have rights, and we still want to participate in society. So that's really one aspect of the disability rights movement. I think a lot of people have the preset notion that modern science is getting rid of disability, but I would argue that it's actually quite the opposite. So I just want to have that little moment of soapbox glory, and now we'll go back to questions.
So yeah, we're almost getting to 6:30 time. So if there's any last few questions.
One
Sorry,
question.
seven.
Here in the room.
Okay.
Just a moment while I move the mic over.
Hi. So just with all the experiences that you've had and August had with physicians, like the way you guys were treated or spoken to, the resources like you were given or not given, what's something that you wish or like hope medical would come out of school knowing or learning, or what do you wish they were taught in school before going out to practice and having patients that have disabilities?
Well, if it's children, that you're not only dealing with the child, but you're dealing with the parent. And sometimes the parent needs help. If you're the parent of a disabled child, half the time you're at your wit's end when you're talking to the doctor, because you are dealing with a very high maintenance person, way more high maintenance than the average typically developing child would be. So just to be conscious, for example, that the parent may come in and they may have anger or problems or depression or some issue that's brought about by being a caregiver for a disabled child. In some ways, I feel that the pediatrician with a disabled child as the patient has to also deal with the patient as the parent. And so just keep in mind the parent also has a hard slog too. And you may just have to factor that into what you say or how you respond to the questions. The parent may often look a little antagonistic. And it may not be because they're really angry at the doctor. They may be angry at the situation. And the doctor's a convenient scapegoat to kind of level. And if you can control and kind of see the bigger picture, that the parent isn't really angry with you, they're angry with something else, but it looks like they're angry with you. And as far as dealing with the child is still a child. I send kids, UNF students, over to volunteer to school where my son went. And I stress to them, you know, these are disabled kids. They're in wheelchairs, they're cognitively impaired. Some have tracheas, some have feeding tubes, some have oxygen, but they're also still kids. And they do silly kid things. And they laugh and giggle and do all sorts of crazy things, even though they may have they don't necessarily know how disabled they are. There's the exuberance of youth will blast through whatever physical and mental issues might be at hand. And if you can see past that to the humanity and also just the basic silliness of the kid, that's a big benefit, I think.
Thank you. So Bella and Dr. Katz have their hands raised. Bella, let you go first, then Dr. Katz.
I have a really quick question. It goes off of something that Roy had mentioned earlier from your book, that you said how people would often say things to you like this happened for a reason, or other things along the line of well wishes, but it doesn't always translate or mean so much, I guess. Like, is there something that strangers can say, or how can strangers, or do you, like, from your experience, like, I guess, how would strangers translate like their true well wishes to you, or make you feel most seen and heard in instances where maybe you felt like that didn't really mean anything to me?
Well, you don't have to transmit anything like that. The thing that I found the most palatable was just, I can't imagine what you're going through, because, you know, it's probably true. You probably can't imagine, and you're acknowledging that it's a serious situation and it's hard to grasp. And people who come with a bromide about this is God's plan, they don't know what's God's plan. You know, who does? We're human. There's no way we can know what God's plans are. So don't tell me that's God's plan, because, you know, I'll wait for God to tell me what his plans are. You don't necessarily have to do anything like that. You could just have a conversation, or you could just go up to the kid and say, hi, you know, and speak to the child, engage with the child, engage with the person like a person. Sometimes it was just tiresome because I felt like my boy was, I was proud of my boy, I show him off, but people would automatically go to the tragic story. This must be a tragic story. And to tell you the truth, you know, we had gotten long beyond the tragic. We didn't think about the tragedy anymore. It was just our life. Our boy was a silly little boy. He laughed a lot. And after a while, he just was another member of the family. We didn't walk around thinking, oh, he's so disabled. He didn't think he was disabled. Once he was home, we didn't even think about it, except that we had these things we had to do, and they could be kind of tedious sometimes. But on the other hand, we didn't walk around feeling sorry for ourselves. There's nothing to be gained from that. And when people come up and want to say something nice, that just puts up a barrier in a way. It's one more thing that makes it hard to be the parent of a disabled child. So I would just say, just interact like, you know, how them Jaguars doing, or something silly. Whatever team appeals, or whatever band, or whatever book, or whatever show, you know, how's Dune? You see Dune? Dune's a really cool movie. That'd be far better than trying to come up with something nice to make people better. Because, you know, and most of the time suddenly I'm called back. Here's the thing, you're in your own thought process, just living your life. Someone comes up and says something like that to you, and then suddenly you got to be reminded, oh yeah, right, I have this kid, I have this situation, and it puts you in a downer place. You don't want that. You just want to be treated as a person interacting with other people in a somewhat typical way.
Thank you.
Dr. Katz? Oh.
Yes, thank you. I had to unmute.
Oh, you're still muted, but your sign is off.
Am I unmuted? Okay. You can hear me?
I can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
I can't hear.
You can't hear Dr. Katz?
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Am I losing everybody?
Yeah. Let me message him.
Somebody say something.
We are. Hello.
Here we are.
Oh, hold on. Let me take these off.
Zoom's not going to cut us off, are they, Roy?
You guys just want me to turn the overhead
No.
mic screen here, though everybody's done if you wanted to clap or something.
I also set the end time for this Zoom as 8:30 to make sure that there would be no chance
Oh.
even to make some esoteric decisions about cutting us off.
Yeah.
So we can go a
Chris?
few more minutes.
Chris, can you hear now?
Now I can hear, yes.
Okay. So I'm going to make a comment and then you've almost, I think you've answered my question. But we talked about, you made a really good, important comment about treating the caregiver, the parent. This also applies in geriatrics. It's across all ages. I was just reviewing a report from the ARP about caregiving, and they asked the question, they surveyed all caregivers, all ages, how often did a healthcare professional, physician, social worker, nurse, ask you about your own health? And the response was 13%. So we have caregivers of children, of older adults, and they're never recognized, as you made that great point, by the healthcare profession. So that's a comment. My question is, you've already outlined some. I want to end this conversation on an upbeat, and can you enumerate even a little bit more the joys that you got from August, that you and your wife received from August, if that's not too a naive question?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I consider myself to be very lucky to be August's father, because I learned incredibly a lot about him and about life because of August, and it opened up lots of new doors that I never would have gone down otherwise. Augie was a great little kid. He was a happy little munchkin. Here's a kid who, it's the indomitable exuberance of youth. Here's a kid who could barely move. He couldn't see for all intents and purposes. He could hear, and he still was giggling and happy. And that was such a strange thing to see for me, that someone who could have so many impairments would still have this joy, this spirit inside. And it really led to a lot of spiritual growth on my part. I know this will sound really hokey, and I know this is probably a secular institution, but I thought on a couple of occasions that I was in the presence of God when I was with August. And I know it's probably some crossing of the wires in my brain, because I don't know what neurochemicals were flowing at that moment, but I felt like I was having this extraordinarily spiritual event. And it happened because of my son, and I don't think it would have happened otherwise. I don't think I would have ever questioned a lot of my fairly secular positions prior to August, but that door got opened for whatever reason, whether it was chemicals or the spirit or whatever, but it changed my life entirely. So, and I could ratchet it down and just talk about the fun times we had playing together and walking, and we did find ways to play together. That was very rewarding for me. So I would say basically, if I were talking to somebody who was contemplating, they had they're pregnant and they see birth anomalies, perhaps in the amniocentesis, to think really hard about whether that's the best. You have to necessarily go to aborting the child is the solution, because that child very well may be an inroad to growth on your part. Now, let me just put a caveat on. I wouldn't say that to anyone without also noting there's not a heck of a lot of social support. The social safety nets are pretty much gone for families like that. You take on a big burden raising a disabled child. So it's a great thing, and it can be also a very, very tough thing. So I would always want to be honest with anyone who is thinking about, having to face that kind of decision, that it's two-edged. My life changed enormously, and knowing what I know now, I never would have wanted to abort August, knowing what I know now. But I do have to caution that there isn't a lot of social support. Does that answer your question, Dr. Katz?
Absolutely. It was a very elegant answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Novakovsky. I'm not sure if there's anything you would like to add.
I would like to ask one quick question, just to finish this out. Dr. Gabbard, can you summarize in just a couple of sentences what Augie taught you about what justice means for disabled people who do require more intensive, more 24/7 care, and who don't speak verbally or in signing?
A child like August exemplifies what's the most human about us. And as human beings, they have every right to have their life respected as anyone else does. And they're really the litmus test. They're the test case. They're the people we go to find out just how compassionate a society we are. And if we see August or people like him in utilitarian terms of dollars and cents, of who's giving back, who's supporting society, then we lose everything that's rich in human interaction. It can't always come down to the transaction of what's being received and what's being given. Sometimes what's being given is not tangible, and yet it's often the most important thing. And that could be love, reason for living. People who may not have a reason for living would find a reason for living because there's a great deal of joy to be had in caregiving. We live so independently in our society. We believe we should be all on our own. And I don't believe that's healthy. I don't believe that makes people happy. I think people would be happier if they learn to give and not always be trying to just live on their own independently and just to hell with everybody else. I just think that's a very unhappy way to go. And people like August give us an opportunity to learn about what we can get from the very act of giving.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Gabbard, very much. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat, and we will go ahead and save them for you to look at later. Thank you again for coming. This was very eye-opening for many students, and even for me, for us who read the book. This was very interesting to hear you speak. I have a copy of the book if anyone wants to reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to share it with you. Thank you all for joining us. And unless anyone else has anything.
I want to thank Roy, you and the Geriatric Interest Group and Dr. Nowakowski for making all this possible as well. And speaking for Dr. Gabbard, I think he'd appreciate it if you bought the book rather than borrow it.
The new version.
Comments in the chat saying some folks are already buying it and really enjoying it.
Well,
yeah, that's the version of Napster trying to or LimeWire moving that book around.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed speaking to you, and I thank you for having spent time with me. Okay, peace. Bye, everybody.